Hello, this module is entitled Sustainable Networks. The learning outcome of this session is to understand the key concepts and principles of sustainability in logistics, including the environmental, social, and economic impacts of logistics operations, and assess the role of different supply chain drivers in improving sustainability. First, we are going to analyze what sustainability is and how it is applied in supply chain management. Second, we are going to identify the role of several supply chain drivers in improving sustainability, and we will analyze some supply chain practices that support the concept of environmental awareness. In the end, the case study of IKEA will highlight from an operations management perspective how a corporation could integrate some sustainability goals to its internal and external production processes and enhance its overall performance. Nowadays, more and more consumers are becoming environmentally conscious, putting a lot of pressure on corporations to operate in a more sustainable way. Companies, on their behalf, are starting to publish annually sustainability reports about their sustainability performance, including information about their carbon footprints, their waste reduction policies, and several other sustainability measures for both in-house and the overall supply chain they perform. This is why sustainability has become a key priority in the design and operation of today's supply chains. The definition of sustainability that is most widely used originates from the United Nations Brundtland Commission, which reported in 1987 that sustainable development is the one that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Almost 20 years later, in 2005, the World Summit of the United Nations introduced a framework identifying economic, environmental, and social sustainability as the three pillars of sustainable development, acknowledging what John Ellington called back in 1997 as the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line concept emphasizes the importance of examining the impact of business decisions on three key fields: the economy, the environment, and society. Another interpretation of these three pillars is the three P's: profit for the economy, planet for the environment, and people for society. The important thing is to comprehend that these three pillars are inevitable, intertwined, and if a corporation aims to be truly sustainable, it must pay regard to a much broader perspective about the impacts of the activities it undertakes in order to remain viable and profitable. Supply chains need to incorporate the philosophy of the three bottom line in order to achieve the long-term viability and continuity of the whole business entity, as well as contributing to the future well-being of society. It is likely that these two goals are mutually supportive. Supply chain strategies that take into consideration environmental performance tend to have a much less cost outcome in the long term due to a better use of resources. Concerning the three pillars of sustainability, there are several elements that contribute to the performance of each pillar. When we are talking about the environment, we are referring to climate change, air pollution, water management, energy use, biodiversity, and several other elements. The social pillar contains all three elements that have to do with the human factor, such as education, labor standards, diversity, and human rights. The third pillar contains all the economic features that influence a corporation's performance, for example, the return on investment, the gross domestic product, GDP, taxes, and so on. It is very easy to understand that the vast majority of all corporations aim for high revenues, cash flow and profitability, excluding non-governmental organizations that typically are established to work toward public or social welfare goals. As we mentioned before, if a corporation claims that operates in a sustainable manner, it is critical not to aim only to fulfill the economic perspective of the triple bottom line approach, but try to engage similarly the other two pillars. In such way, it could be beneficial for the corporation not only to achieve its environmental goals, but to have simultaneously a cost-efficient outcome. For example, if a company aims to utilize its transport capacity in a much more efficient way through better routing and scheduling, it could result not only in a more cost-efficient result due to a smaller number of routes, but also to a reduced environmental impact of transport due to less fuel consumption and carbon emissions. Thus, it is very important to take into consideration the sustainability impact from the early stages of a product or service development until its disposal. There are many actions that can improve the supply chain performance in all three pillars. As we analyzed in Module 2, the modular design in a production process can be beneficial from a sustainability perspective. A great example is the use of modular design by IKEA with its flat-packed product design, which allows the company to reduce the space its products occupy from the production location to its retail shops and from there to the final customers. Modular design allows the company to simultaneously reduce emissions as well as its transportation costs due to the decreased distribution routes that need to be taken for the products to reach their final destination. Due to the fact that the majority of the sustainability-related efforts are accompanied with a cost that the supply chain incurs for a benefit that may be more universal, a performance measurement along all three pillars is required in order to evaluate the impact that those efforts have in the whole supply chain. Although the measurement in a supply chain concerning the economic pillar seems unsophisticated through several financial KPIs, when it comes to measuring and reporting the performance of the social and environmental pillars, there are two challenges. The first one is related to the scope over which a category is measured. For instance, considering a company that only reports its energy consumption within its own operations, whether decides to outsource some of its own production to an external supplier, there will be a decrease in its own energy consumption, even though the energy consumption of the whole supply chain would remain the same or it may increase. That's why it is very important to set the scope of measurement in order to avoid overlapping among the performance measurement of different entities in the supply chain. The second challenge relates to the use of relative or absolute measures of performance. A relative measure may report the carbon footprint per unit of output, whereas an absolute measure reports the total amount of carbon footprint. Although the use of an absolute measure reports a full impact over a supply chain, a relative measure of performance is more effective at capturing performance. Either way, it's important that the measurement is conducted in the same basic unit through the supply chain, because each category can be measured to a variety of units, such as euros of sales, kilograms of output, or square feet of space. At this point, we should elaborate the environmental and social pillar in order to highlight why these two pillars are mainly responsible for a supply chain sustainability performance. As we have already mentioned, the social pillar measures a company's ability to address issues concerning its customers, its personnel, and society in general. Also, in this dimension, there are included several important human-related factors such as health and safety, training, and diversity. It is common for several corporations to outsource several of their production activities to external suppliers in order to achieve economies of scale, have a better product outcome due to the supplier's expertise, and several other benefits. However, it is crucial for the outsourcer or any other supplier to be aligned with the corporation's code of conduct. Otherwise, it is certain that there will be some major conflicts and confusion that might derogate the corporation's reputation. It is not acceptable for any company to compromise its legacy and its customers' perception when it comes to cooperating with a supplier that does not share the company's values, culture, or way of thinking. A characteristic example is Walmart, which sources significant amounts of products from third parties all over the world. In its Global Responsibility Report, Walmart claims that put a lot of effort into worker safety, anti-human trafficking, and women's empowerment. For what reason? Walmart created standards for suppliers, requiring its suppliers to eliminate forced or child labor and look after the health and safety of workers, among others. In 2012, after performing thousands of audits to its supply base all over the globe, Walmart ceased production in 214 factories due to serious violations. Similarly, Starbucks introduces the coffee and farmer equity cafe practices to support its suppliers in emerging economies as they increasingly focus on sustainability. As for the environmental pillar, there are several activities that can improve a company's impact on the environment, such as resource reduction, product innovation, and energy reduction. For instance, Starbucks' ability to reduce water consumption in its company-operated stores is a great example of resource reduction. Though energy reduction remains a straightforward policy that leads to sustainability, product innovation is quite an interesting path concerning the green sustainable way of operations. In this specific context, the company could redesign its production process and reduce its environmental costs by developing much more eco-efficient products or services. A characteristic example is Daimler Chrysler, which refined its process design for the second generation of smart car to be even more friendly to the environment. The car itself was roughly 87% recyclable, with everything from the interior components to the exterior panels both made from recycled materials and recyclable themselves. Also, to make a reference to modularity, the modular construction of a car helped the dismantling at the end of its life. Additionally, the plant's environmentally friendly painting technique allowed less paint to be used. Another example of product innovation with positive environmental impact is the high-efficiency toilets that are used in most airports all over the world. The toilet's dual flush button allows users to significantly reduce their water discharge. It was back in 1968 when the ecologist Garrett Harding introduced the concept of tragedy of the commons. This concept, which is widely discussed in several sciences besides ecology and economics, originated from Aristotle, who wrote that which is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. Men pay most attention to what is their own. They care less for what it is common. The tragedy of the commons is expressed in a dilemma arising when the common good does not align perfectly with the good of individual entities. Harding provided an example to illustrate the specific concept. Should a pack of herders with cattle enjoy unfettered access to a pasture which is valuable and finite resource, each herder attempts to maximize his gain from this public asset. When one herder's cattle feed in the pasture, the herder gains from their growth and all the gains accrue only to him. However, any cost of overgrazing is spread over all herders whose cattle feed at the pasture. The rain is the tragedy that Harding foresees. He claims that every person is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world where all resources are finite. There is no future when everyone pursues his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Harding gives the same interpretation concerning environmental pollution. Every individual and any firm releases waste into the environment in several forms such as chemicals, sewage, and carbon dioxide. The individual or the firm would incur the entire cost of reducing the amount of waste it discards, whereas the rest of the world shares the burden of the cost of waste he threw into the environment. This is the reason why every company who operates in the global environment faces the challenge of the tragedy of the commons. They must compete against other companies that may be extracting benefits from the resource commons without spending anything to maintain them. In order to avoid such conflicts among the members of a society and achieve a much more impartial allocation of the common resources and the costs that bind them, Harding introduces the idea of mutual coercion. This solution is based on the idea that all participants won't tend to the commons of their own free will, therefore there should be a mechanism, laws, measures, or a social arrangement that coerces all participants to behave in a way that helps the common good. Mutual coercion can be attempted through a command and control approach or market mechanisms. In a command and control approach, the government or regulators set standards that everybody must adhere to. A characteristic example is the air quality standards and objectives set by the European Union concerning the carbon monoxide emissions and several other pollutants that the EU authorities set out to eradicate. Additionally, from the European Union comes another directive, the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, widely known as WEEE or e-waste, which is about to treat waste electrical and electronic equipment to contribute to sustainable production and consumption through recycling and disposal guidances. A typical example of a market mechanism is an emission tax that sets a price on each unit of pollution. When a tax is introduced on pollution, the entity that produces the pollution incurs an additional cost based on the amount of pollution emitted to the environment. In this way, an incentive arises to the entity to reduce the pollution it causes by changing the production processes or adapting a new, more eco-friendly technology. Eventually, the more emissions can be reduced, the less tax a firm would pay. Another mechanism is referred to as a cap and trade program, which is a more quantity-based approach. According to this approach, instead of setting a price on each unit of pollution, the regulatory authority determines the total quantity of pollution that will be allowed. How does it work? For instance, a regulatory authority creates a limited number of tradable emission allowances that the companies must secure and surrender in proportion to their emissions. If a company fails to surrender the appropriate number of allowances, then a fine will be imposed. The cap and trade mechanism starts with the regulatory authority creating a limited number of total allowances that are distributed among all companies in the economy. Companies are allowed to buy and sell emission allowances based on their performance and their needs. The supply and demand for allowances create the trading price. Once again, the companies have an incentive to reduce their emissions because they get a financial reward for this improvement by selling their additional allowances to those who are not willing or not able to reduce their emissions. Market-based options are more preferable to command and control regulations because they provide greater flexibility for firms. Either way, with all approaches we mentioned, the goal is accomplished due to the fact that every entity has a reason to reduce its emissions, the waste, and all its pollutants that harm the environment. As we have already mentioned, it is important to understand that supply chain decisions have a wider impact on the environment and generally on resources. In order to achieve that, we need to examine the effect of economic activity on the use of resources across the value chain as a whole. Concerning the 5 stages of a company's value chain, the decisions that are taken in each stage can have significant implications not only for resource requirements but also for the wider environment. Starting with the design stage, it is widely accepted that the product's design can have a significant impact across the supply chain. Most of the companies are focusing on reducing the amount of packaging materials, which is not wrong, but there are more efficient ways to improve resource sustainability. The managers who are responsible for the product's design could focus on the product's physical characteristics and packaging outfit using much more eco-friendly materials and could emphasize on how the product could be reused or recycled after the end of its life. The next stage in a product's value chain is sourcing. More and more sustainable sourcing is emerging as the most important element when selecting suppliers. Depending on how the upstream materials and products in a supply chain are sourced and made, there can be major differences in resource consumption for the entire supply chain. An interesting example comes from the food and beverage industry, where SABMiller, one of the world's biggest beer producers, compared the water footprint that the company had in 2 different countries, South Africa and the Czech Republic, where its crop production is located. The company's top management found out that the South African water footprint was greater than the Czech Republic footprint due to the fact that the African soil required a higher level of evaporation. In absolute numbers, it required 155 liters of water to produce a liter of beer in South Africa, whether it only required 55 liters of water to produce a liter of beer in the Czech Republic. The difference is overwhelming concerning the impact on the environment. The next stage in line has to do with manufacturing processes. In this stage, the company deals with its energy consumption and how it manages the disposal of its waste and toxic materials and effluents. In order to have a lower impact on the environment, the use of renewable energy sources in the manufacturing process is ideal. The new technology that is now evolving, such as solar panels and windmills that could bring energy efficiency, could could be beneficial for the environment in the long term. Moving to the end of a product's value chain, there is the delivery stage. All the decisions on the mode of transport and distribution will affect a supply chain's carbon footprint, as will the extent to which transport capacity is efficiently used. There are several other parameters that can have a wider impact on supply chain sustainability. The parameters could be the number, the location, and the design of the distribution centers, the number of the cross-dockings among the supply chain network, even the decision whether to outsource a production activity or keep it in-house. Overall, the supply chain's network configuration is the main theme of this stage. Finally, there is the return stage, the term usually used to describe the process of bringing products back normally at the end of life, but also for recall and repair, is reverse logistics. Nowadays, there are stringent regulations concerning product disposal and reuse or recycling requirements, and that's the reason why many corporations are paying much more attention to these backwards procedures. A representative example of reverse logistics is Xerox, a company which manufactures office equipment, including scanners, printers, and its expendables, such as toners. Its goal is to design products and supply chain process that enable a sustainable end-of-life recovery program to be achieved. There are several practices that could help a company achieve its sustainability goals. The first one is the concept of circular economy. The World Economic Forum describes the circular economy as restorative or regenerative by intention and design. According to IKEA, a circular supply chain is one where every product is designed and produced with its next use in mind. The mindset that IKEA has behind this interpretation is that it treats the idea of waste as a valuable resource for production. IKEA's Chief Sustainability Officer, Lena Prip-Kovacs, emphasized that it is crucial to design all products from the very beginning as to be repurposed, repaired, reused, resold, and recycled, generating as little waste as possible and using only renewable or recycled materials in the production of all goods. In the same direction, Ellen MacArthur Foundation explains that in circular economy, the goal is to stop waste from being produced in the first place. That's how the concept of circular supply chain is introduced in opposition to linear supply chain. Whereas linear supply chains are based on the model of take, make, dispose, circular economy supply chains are based around reuse, sharing, repair, refurbishment, remanufacturing, and recycling. The specific supply chain configuration enables the circular flow of goods and links resources, products, and consumers, providing several benefits for the entire supply chain, such as an increased business value, reduced resource consumption, and reduced production costs. Corporate social responsibility, CSR, is a management concept through which companies integrate social and environmental concerns in their business operations and interactions with their stakeholders. The purpose of CSR is to encourage businesses to conduct their companies in an ethical manner and work towards having a more positive impact on society through social actions such as safety standards and working conditions, and environmental actions such as waste management, energy, and water conservation. Although a company could contribute to society through sponsorships, philanthropy, or charities, enhancing its reputation and its brand, CSR remains a much more strategic business management tool. A properly implemented CSR program can bring several competitive advantages for a company, such as increased sales and profits, enhanced customer retention and loyalty, increased investment opportunities, and increased employee engagement. A successful CSR program assures that a firm will equally apply its strategy to the economic, environmental, and social imperatives, achieving a much more sustainable development. We have already mentioned the process of reverse logistics, which remains a popular practice that enhances a firm's sustainable performance. Reverse logistics comprises of the sector of supply chains that process anything returning backwards through the supply chain or traveling the opposite direction through the supply chain from the end customer through production planning to raw material suppliers. Several circumstances are generally referred to as reverse logistics and usually relate mostly to product recall for quality or safety reasons, used packaging or products for recycling or disposal, and the return of unwanted goods from the downstream customers. Although reverse logistics are an excellent tool for sustainability purposes such as waste management and recycling products, they can also provide several other benefits to a supply chain. Among the advantages of customer retention, enhanced service, and reduced costs, reverse logistics can provide valuable product data which could be crucial for the correction of existing issues that might be causing the return of products. The closed-loop supply chain model aims to reduce the volume of raw materials needed in the production line through the recovery and reuse of post-consumer materials. In a broader perspective, reverse logistics, closed-loop supply chain model, and circular economy share the same goal of sustainability. There could be a difference between reverse logistics and a closed-loop supply chain, assuming that reverse logistics are usually triggered when there's an issue with products, and these often end in waste, but that doesn't apply today. Closed-loop systems aim to combine the two flows in supply chain, onwards and backwards, to make a more cohesive, less wasteful network. Actually, a closed-loop supply chain is a circular supply chain which imprints the philosophy of circular economy. From an academic perspective, there could be a difference between the two models. In one side, a closed-loop supply chain generates substantial amounts of waste, but it is rarely feasible to reuse or recycle all unwanted items within the same supply chain. On the other side, a circular supply chain goes further by recovering value from waste by collaborating with other organizations within the industrial sector or with different industrial sectors. One of the most successful examples of a closed-loop supply chain is the single-use cameras. The process of manufacturing was successful since the costs were low and the incentives from both sides, manufacturers and consumers, were right. The cost of collecting the single-use cameras was low because customers naturally brought them directly to a retailer in order to print their pictures. No further incentives were needed to encourage customer returns. Manufacturers had the right incentive since the specific remanufacturing process saved them money and there was no difference in price between the remanufactured single-use camera and a new one. In this subsection, we will try to correlate the 6 supply chain drivers with sustainability practices and figure out how technology could contribute to such an alignment. The facilities in a supply chain are responsible for huge amounts of energy and water consumption, besides emitting greenhouse gases into the environment. Despite all that, there's plenty of room for improvement and sustainability efficiency. Successful companies such as IKEA and Walmart have designed, planned, and started operating a much more energy efficient, viable retail store, taking some actions that reduced their gas emissions by almost 30%. Those actions included the installation of LED light bulbs and building skylights for natural light. Another good example comes from Coca-Cola, which has worked hard to reuse heat energy from boilers in its production process and reduce its total water footprint. Another example which could lead to a profitable outcome is the use of technology to balance the peak load of energy across a chain of retail shops. By suitably splitting the time that freezers, air conditioners, and any other electric device at its stores are turned on, the supply chain can reduce the peak demand for energy across the retail shop network, resulting in lower costs for the supply chain and a reduced demand for peak load in the electrical grid. There are several companies that design and support hardware and software necessary to operate such systems. The inventories that are considered as assets by most firms are the raw materials, the work in process, and the finished goods. Only a few firms are taking into consideration the inventory that sits in a landfill. The important thing is that when a firm's product is discarded in a landfill after its use, the cost of the specific inventory is borne collectively by society. The damage for the company and society would be the additional cost of maintaining the inventory and the consumption of valuable energy and resources to do so. We have already proposed solutions for such occasions with the design of closed-loop supply chains and reverse logistics. Additionally, with the inventory management software programs, there could be real-time information about the level of stock and the ability to collect any data that could help the firm reduce or at least limit the harmful inventory. The main objective concerning the transportation driver is to reduce the supply chain's emissions. The easiest way to achieve such a goal is to reduce the number of distribution routes, but that's not strategically ideal. A better supply chain network design is a proper solution. Also, product innovation could contribute to reducing transportation costs, such as the use of more efficient fuels. A renewal of a company's fleet with much more eco-friendly vehicles may increase the costs in the short term, but it is a long-term investment concerning the supply chain's environmental impact and its sustainability performance. Another interesting solution for reducing transportation cost and emission comes from the IKEA case study, where the design of its products played a significant role in achieving its sustainability goals. With designing and delivering its flat packaged products, IKEA managed not only to reduce its truck loads, but also to make its customers to be part of the production process, enhancing in this way its customer retention and loyalty. Referring to the fourth driver, which is sourcing, we must highlight that for most companies, the greatest social and environmental impact occurs in the extended supply chain outside their own enterprise. The example we mentioned earlier with Saab Miller, which outsourced an important part of its production process to low-cost countries, resulting in a negative environmental impact, highlights the fact that global sourcing is highly responsible for the entire supply chain sustainability performance. Verifying and tracking supplier performance regarding sustainability is the only way to secure that there is an alignment in culture, mindset, and strategic goals among the supply chain entities, but it is a very challenging task. A characteristic example comes also from IKEA, which introduces to its suppliers the I-Way Code of Conduct. I-Way is the IKEA way for responsibly producing products, services, materials, and components. IKEA suppliers must comply with I-Way requirements whether they wish to remain in the company's procurement program. Valid and solid information is one of the biggest challenges to improve supply chain sustainability. The Global Reporting Initiative is an international independent standards organization aims to address this challenge, providing a sustainability reporting framework which has been adopted by many organizations and corporations all over the world. The major difficulty of having a common set of standards for measurement and reporting is because incentives are not aligned across different firms. Other than that, the use of consistent scorecards within a supply chain can go a long way towards aligning the sustainability efforts of all members of the extended supply chain. Pricing, as the last supply chain driver, has its part in sustainability practices. Differential pricing, either by load or time of day, has the potential to make a significant difference in the usage of energy by consumers. An example from the airlines industry reveals indirectly how pricing has a major impact on sustainability performance. Revenue management is totally exercised by the airline companies in order to achieve the best possible revenue outcome. This exact management practice has the potential to make the aircrafts fly at full capacity, improving airline profits while reducing the fuel consumption and emissions per passenger. Simultaneously, it delays the need for the airline companies to purchase new airplanes. But the biggest challenge about sustainability and pricing is changing the customer's willingness to pay for a product that is produced and distributed by a supply chain in a more sustainable manner, but ends up costing more, having a higher purchase price. This is where the supply chains have a quandary. To go full green but with more expensive products or services, or for the consumers to continue operating without focusing on sustainability and keep the prices as low as possible in order to bring more customers? We have already mentioned the solution of providing government incentives not only for the firms, but also for the consumers to behave more sustainably, as it is beneficial for both parties in the long term. Finally, it is important to highlight the factors driving an increased focus on supply chain sustainability. First, we have reducing risk and improving the financial performance of the supply chain. Although sustainability is the main point of this module, we cannot just put out of the picture a firm's financial performance, since it is an essential element in the firm's viability. Then we have the community pressures and government mandates. From the overall analysis, we saw how important the role of regulatory authorities is, providing incentives for all stakeholders in society and the economy to support sustainable development. Last, the factor of attracting customers that value sustainability ensures that all of supply chain's investments on sustainable development will have a positive impact on its customers, and that the customers will be much more socially responsible, having a major concern for the sustainability of the economy, the society, and the environment.